I'm very happy to be back in Holland because I actually spent my 2 first years as a young architect working here. So I could do this presentation in Dutch, but none of the other guys did, so I'll stick to English. Een beetje. But actually, sort of architecture is, if you like, sort of the art and science of us human beings, continually refurbishing the surface of our planet so it actually fits better to the way we want to live. And that's why we find it so paradoxical that the public debate about architecture is so often restricted to just sort of looking at the final result, like sort of contemplating the architectural object. Is it beautiful? Is it ugly? And sort of a typical example of how the public media treats architectural debate is whether or not Norman Foster's new tower in London looks like a gherkin or a sausage or a dildo. So recently we asked ourselves if there was actually a way of telling stories with architecture, sort of going behind the scenes, looking at all the different forces of society, the cultural, the political, the economical forces that sort of influence the designs and actually shape our world and our buildings and our cities into the way they are. So we tried to imagine if there was a way to use images and drawings and pictures to actually tell stories about architecture. We basically sort of turned our work into this sort of comic book about architecture because we really wanted to sort of communicate not just how good or bad the building looks, but like how it actually became what it is. And we called our comic book "Yes is More," which is obviously a sort of evolution of Mies van der Rohe's "Less is More," this sort of modern architect who triggered the modern revolution with this sort of idea liberating architecture from the constraints of style or history and making it about sort of pure essence. But quickly, this idea like degenerated into some kind of minimalistic manifesto, and that triggered the postmodern counter-revolution. Robert Venturi saying, "Less is a bore. Why do modern buildings have to be so boring?" Then Philip Johnson came, saying, "I'm a whore," introducing the potential of, let's say, promiscuity or at least sort of openness to new ideas. He died recently and he left an estate in New Canaan with 14 different buildings that looked like they had been designed by radically different architects. They were actually all designed by him. So, as life evolves, so should architecture. Then came a local hero, Rem Koolhaas, the guy who kept me sort of encaged in Rotterdam for like almost 2 years, with his statement, "More and more is more," sort of observing the impact of sort of globalization and global capitalism on urban space, sort of suspending judgment and sort of purely observing what's going on. Then recently, Obama sort of introduced optimism in a time of global financial crisis, but sort of more specifically, he was running in opposition with a very unpopular president, and he could easily have sort of taken the traditional sort of opposition card of always saying the opposite of the sitting guy, but instead he said, there are no red states of America, there are no blue states, there's the United States of America, like this idea of like not focusing on the conflict. But what we're trying to say with "Yes is More" is essentially this idea that the typical image of the avant-garde is this sort of angry young man rebelling against the establishment. Somehow radicality is almost always negatively defined. The stereotypical sort of progressive architect is this sort of frustrated person standing in the corner, angry at the world for not fitting in with his or her ideas. So rather than sort of the concept of revolution against something, we're much more interested in the idea of evolution, the idea that things gradually evolve, that sort of by incorporating different inputs from the turmoil of the world, you can actually sort of evolve new ideas. As a matter of fact, we think that Charles Darwin is one of the best people to ever sort of describe how our design process actually works. His famous diagram from the origin of species, the evolutionary tree, could almost be a diagram of how our design works in the office. That a design evolves through this sort of series of generations of design meetings. At each meeting, we have like way too many ideas. Only a few of them manage to survive. And maybe we sort of choose a really beautiful model and a very functional one, and then we try to mate them, and then they have sort of different mutant offspring. Some of them are sort of hopeless abortions, and some of them are like really promising steps, and then gradually an idea evolves. One example of this was a project we did for a new city library and hotel and conference center in downtown Copenhagen. And the site was like a very small site for a really big program, so it was like really tough, a tough project. And so the design process was almost like this sort of struggle for survival. Like 100 sort of different individuals had to sort of live and die in order to reach this sort of final idea of almost like a rational tower melting together with the surrounding city. So essentially expanding the public space from the ground floor up to the roof, almost like a sort of a Scandinavian version of the Spanish Steps in Rome, sort of public on the outside as well as on the inside with the library cascading. But Darwin doesn't only explain how a single idea evolves. Also, as you can see, sometimes a species branches off. We might sit in a design meeting and there's like a really great idea, but it doesn't really fit in with this context. But in another country, with another client, with another program, it could actually become the right answer to a completely different question. Because of that, we never throw anything out. We keep all our models in the office. Our office is almost like a sort of an archive of architectural biodiversity. Because we never know which model might actually be the one we need. And what I'd like to do today is tell you the story of 3 projects and tell you sort of how they evolved through this sort of gradual process of excess and selection. The first story started like a year and a half ago when we went to to Shanghai to do the competition for the Danish pavilion for the Shanghai World Expo. And we saw this guy, Hai Bao, who's the mascot for the expo. And he seemed strangely familiar. In fact, he looked like a building we had designed for a hotel, conference center, and spa in Umeå in the north of Sweden. When we submitted the project, we thought like this was a really cool building, but it didn't exactly look like something from the north of Sweden. And the Swedish jury didn't think so either, so we lost the project. But then we had a meeting with a Chinese businessman from Guangxi, and he saw the building, and he said sort of, wow, that's the Chinese character for the word people. So apparently this is how you write people in Chinese. We even double-checked. And at the same time, we got an invitation to exhibit at the Shanghai Creative Industry Week, and we thought like, this is too much. We stumbled upon what could be sort of the landmark of the People's Republic of China. So we hired a feng shui master, and then we scaled the building up 3 times to Chinese proportions, and went to China. So this is the People's Building, as we called it, on the Huangpu River. Our 2 interpreters like reading the architecture. And it went straight on the cover of Wen Hui Bao newspaper, which made Mr. Yang Yu-chen, the mayor of Shanghai, come to the exhibition. We had a chance to explain him the project, and his response was that sort of Shanghai is the city in the world with most skyscrapers, but to him it was as if the sort of connection to the Chinese roots had been cut over. And for the first time with the People's Building, he saw an architecture that could bridge the gap between the ancient wisdom of China and the progressive future of China. So we obviously profoundly agree with him. Unfortunately, Mr. Chen is now in prison for corruption. But like I said, Hai Bao looked very familiar because he is, in fact, the Chinese character for people. And the reason they chose this mascot is because the subject of the expo is better city, better life, sustainability. And we thought like sustainability is this sort of idea that has quite often been interpreted as some kind of a neo-Protestant concept that it has to hurt in order to do good. You're not supposed to take long, warm showers. It's not good for the environment. You're not supposed to fly on holidays because flying is bad for the environment. So gradually we get this idea that sustainable life is less fun than normal life. So we thought that, which is like obviously not a very competitive position for sustainability. So we thought, like, why don't we focus on examples where sustainability actually increases the quality of life? We also asked ourselves, what can Denmark possibly show the Chinese that would be relevant to them? You know, Denmark, China, one of the biggest countries in the world. Denmark, one of the smallest. China, symbolized by the great Chinese dragon. In Denmark, we have a national bird, the swan. China has many great poets, but we discovered that in the Chinese Republic's public school curriculum, they have 3 fairy tales by An Tushung, or Hans Christian Andersen, as we call him. And that means that all 1.3 billion Chinese actually grew up with The Emperor's New Clothes, The Matchstick Girl, and The Little Mermaid. So it's almost like a little piece of Danish culture that has been integrated into Chinese culture. The biggest tourist attraction in China is the Great Wall of China, the only sort of man-made object that can be seen from outer space. The biggest tourist attraction in Denmark is the Little Mermaid, that can sort of hardly be seen from the canal tours. And you know, it's these sort of obvious differences, you know, like Shanghai and Copenhagen are both port cities, but of completely different scales and qualities. But then we looked at sort of recent urban development. 30 years ago, this is what a street looked like in Shanghai. All bicycles, no cars. This is what it looks like today. Traffic jams everywhere. And the bicycle has even become forbidden in several places in Shanghai to not disturb the car. Meanwhile, in Copenhagen, we're actually sort of expanding our bicycle lanes. More than a third of all Copenhageners commute by bike. And we have this sort of system of city bikes that we've had for 15 years. I think originally inspired by Amsterdam, but the first time you tried in Amsterdam, they all got stolen. So we evolved that idea by making them more uncomfortable, so they don't get stolen. But basically, we thought, like, why don't we actually relaunch the bicycle as something cool in China? We donate 1,000 city bikes, so that when you come to the expo, you should go straight to the Danish pavilion, move around, grab a Danish bike, and then you continue on your Danish bike to visit Happy Street and all the other sort of pavilions. Because essentially, like, these sort of expos tend to be a lot of state-financed propaganda, like a lot of big statements, a lot of images, but no real experience. Here, we're not really talking about the bicycle. People can try it, and if they like it, you know, maybe they'll use it. Also, like I mentioned, both Copenhagen and Shanghai are port cities. But in Copenhagen, our water has become so clean that you can swim in it. One of our first projects was actually we did the Danish harbor bath in Copenhagen that sort of extends public life into the water. So we thought, like, why don't we take this idea to China also, but rather than talking about it, why don't we actually sail 1 million liters of harbor water from Copenhagen harbor to Shanghai? This is where the environmentalists normally object that it doesn't sound super sustainable to sail water. But in fact, the ships, they go full of goods from China to Denmark, and then they sail more or less empty back. So quite often the ships take seawater in for ballast to remain steady at sea. So we can actually hitch a ride for free all the way back. And in the middle of this sort of pool of Danish water surrounded by Danish bikes, we're going to put the Little Mermaid, like not a copy, but the real mermaid. So that the 1.3 billion Chinese that grew up with her can actually experience her in real life. So essentially, the pavilion is conceived as like a loop of exhibition, like with bicycles on the roof. When you arrive at the pavilion, you go sort of through the exhibition around the mermaid pool. You arrive out on the roof, you start searching for a bike, you jump on your bike, and then you go through the last part of the exhibition and out into Shanghai. So when we were so lucky to win the competition, we were asked to sort of organize an exhibition at the Shanghai Urban Center. And to our surprise, when we submitted the boards for printing, the Chinese censorship sent them back with corrections. So first of all, we had compared like Denmark and China. Then they say, the China map missed Taiwan. It's a very serious political issue in China. We will add on. Sort of, okay. Then we had compared the swan to the dragon. And then the Chinese state says, suggest change to panda. So like there's like an incredible care in the censorship. But basically, when it came out in Denmark that we were going to move the mermaid, the Danish Nationalist Party, which is this sort of anti-immigration, anti-almost anything party, they tried to pass a law against moving the mermaid. And for the first time, I was invited to speak at the National Parliament. It was kind of interesting. On the same day, from 9 to 11, they were discussing the bailout package, like how many billions were we going to invest in saving the Danish economy. Then they had a 30-minute recess, and then from 11:30 to 1:30, they were discussing whether or not to send the mermaid to China. But sort of to conclude, if you'd like to see the mermaid next year from May to December, don't come to Copenhagen, because she's going to be in Shanghai. If you do come, you'll probably see an installation by this guy, Ai Weiwei. He's promised to make like an art installation for the 6 months she's gone. Or if the Chinese state intervenes, it could be a panda sort of sitting on the stone. It's currently under construction. The next story I'd like to tell is actually starting sort of in my own house. This is my house. This is my apartment. And the view from my apartment overlooking this sort of landscape of triangular balconies, our client quickly called them the Leonardo DiCaprio balconies. They have this sort of effect that they transform the south facade of the building into a social space. That sort of on a nice summer day, you'll actually get to meet all the young ladies in a sort of 10-meter radius around your apartment. They're called the VM house because we basically distorted a square block so that all of the apartments have straight views of the surroundings instead of looking straight at each other. This used to be the view from my apartment. It was a place where our client bought the site and said that he wanted to do a combination of 10,000 square meters of apartments and 20,000 square meters of parking. And we thought, like, rather than doing like a big stack of apartments looking at a big boring block of parking, perhaps we could sort of turn all the apartments into penthouses, put them on a podium of cars. And because Copenhagen is completely flat, if you want to have a nice south-facing slope with a view, you have to do it yourself. So we sort of tilted the site. Then we cut up the volume so we wouldn't steal the view from my apartment. And essentially, the parking occupies all the deep space sort of beneath the housing. And then on top, you have sort of this sort of nice layer of apartments that combine sort of all the splendors of a suburban lifestyle, a house with a garden, but with a penthouse view and a sort of dense urban location. So this is our model. This is what it looked like last year. And essentially, the apartments form the roof of the parking. They are accessed with a single diagonal elevator. It's a standard product from Switzerland, because in Switzerland you have a natural need for diagonal elevators. And the parking, rather than being this sort of claustrophobic space where especially women might be afraid of parking, it's transformed into this like generous open space. We call it sort of a cathedral of car culture. And sort of the outer facade of the project is basically the parking facing the city. And since we wanted to make it naturally ventilated, not spend any energy on pumps and fans, it needed to be perforated so it could breathe naturally. And we found out that by changing the size of the holes, 6 different sizes, up to 3 centimeters in diameter, we could actually turn the entire facade into a gigantic rasterized image. And because we always refer to the project as the mountain, we ended up commissioning this sort of Japanese Himalaya photographer that has actually transformed the entire north facade of the building into this sort of gigantic urban artwork. And finally, sort of, if you continue back into the galleries, you go into the apartments. It's almost like traveling into a parallel universe. From the colors and the cars, you have this sort of south-facing urban oasis. Your wood floor continues outside. And as you sort of continue out, you go into the garden and the grass. And all the rainwater that is falling on the mountain is actually collected in a big water tank. And in dry periods, it's sort of naturally circulated. so that in 1 or 2 years, the entire mountain should turn into this sort of gigantic sort of Cambodian temple ruin, completely covered in green. Sort of, I like this image, that it looks like 100 of these guys like jumped over the canal and climbed up to the 10th floor, like this sort of mountain of suburbia. The last thing, as sort of to conclude, is sort of as an architect, you might be sort of interested in various sort of ideologies or big ideas, but you never have like the political power or the financial resources to realize any of your visions. So you always depend on sort of the chaos of the world or like the decisions of others to realize your ideas. One sort of typical example is that last summer we were so lucky that we won a competition to design a Scandinavian national bank. We even sort of designed the office of the director of the bank. This is him when he was still smiling. So when we won the competition, we were like extremely excited. Unfortunately, it was the National Bank of Iceland. But at the same time, we actually had a visitor from Azerbaijan. One of the ministers of Azerbaijan came to Denmark. We showed him around, and he really liked the mountain, and he really liked the idea that you could actually make mountains out of architecture. So he told us that the capital of Azerbaijan, called Baku, is this sort of bay overlooking a desert island where that would be perfect for human life. But the president had never opened it for development because he was afraid that some kind of wall of mediocre high-rises would ruin the view of the Caspian Sea from the entire city. So he said that since Azerbaijan is known as the Alps of Central Asia, could we perhaps make an urban development that would sort of recreate the silhouettes of the 7 most significant mountains of Azerbaijan? So it was kind of a crazy megalomaniac idea. So we totally liked it. So I'm going to finish by showing this small movie explaining the project. And we quite often make these little films about our work, but we always argue for very long what music to put on the video. But in this case, it was like a really obvious choice. So basically, Baku is organized like this sort of crescent bay overlooking the island of Zira. Excellent, thanks. And our basic task was to sample the 7 most famous mountains of Azerbaijan and reinterpret them into these sort of functional urban structures sort of suited for human life. We would then sort of plan them on the island around a central valley of a green park. And because the island is a piece of desert, it has no water, it has no plants, it has no energy, it has no infrastructure, we decided to consider the entire island an ecosystem. So basically using wind energy to drive desalination plants, delivering fresh water, using the thermal properties of water to heat and cool the buildings, using the sun to heat the water for human use, and finally sort of organically cleaning the wastewater. Instead of putting it into a sewer, we made these like root zone gardens that would sort of gradually filter the water through the landscape and would actually increase the amount of water, gradually turning the desert into a green, lush landscape. So you can say that where sort of urban development is quite often happening at the expense of nature, here it would actually create the nature. And also these sort of mountain neighborhoods or buildings, they don't only look like mountains, they also operate like mountains in the sense that they create sort of shelter from the wind, they accumulate the heat of the sun, and they collect all the rainwater. So after 6 months of planning, we presented the project to the president, and sort of before the summer, we actually signed the contract for the master plan and the 3 first mountains. So through this sort of process of sort of, you can say sort of architectural evolution of ideas, the mountain in Copenhagen has turned into the 7 peaks of Azerbaijan, which is going to be the first sort of carbon neutral island in Central Asia. Thank you.